Well, hello, Clyde. Buenas noches. ¿Cómo está? Well, I found this picture here on Google Images, and I really like it because it kind of illustrates something that I use in my teaching about the nervous system, suggesting that there are certain areas of the brain where the lights are on, and there are certain areas of the brain where there's no conscious awareness of anything. And I refer to that oftentimes in my teaching. So what you see lighted up there, those are the areas of the cerebral cortex, areas where the lights are on, where you have conscious awareness and conscious control over things. Obviously, those lights go out if you're asleep, but your physiology continues when you're asleep. So all of that is done in areas or is initiated in areas of the brain where the lights are never on. So we're going to look at those areas in this particular performance. Let me say a few things about how this comes about. There is in the developing embryo at about 21 days of development a structure called the neural tube. The neural tube will develop dilations along its length. The anterior most or the topmost, I guess you would say, of those dilations, we will later call the telencephalon. It is the telencephalon that develops into the cerebral hemispheres. Just a little bit posterior, or we would say south from there, the next dilation is called the diencephalon. The diencephalon structures include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Well, as we go down the tube just one step farther, we come to an area called the mesencephalon, M-E-S, mesencephalon. The mesencephalon remains the mesencephalon for the duration of development. We simply call it the midbrain, but as it develops, we say, well, that area of the brain is the mesencephalon. Just posterior or south from there, as you go down the tube, the next dilation that we see is the metencephalon, M-E-T. The metencephalon develops into the pons and the cerebellum. And then finally, the last little dilation of the neural tube that we see developing, that will be called the myelencephalon. The myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. So anyway, this is just an introduction to where we're going here. So we will start at the medulla oblongata and work our way up until we have covered the structures of the brainstem and the cerebellum. Next slide, please. Well, expert in the anatomy of the spinal cord that I know you are by now, let's review a little bit of that before we cover the brainstem. Perhaps you recall that the spinal cord has ascending pathways, tracts, or fasciculi, we call them. Those are carrying afferent or sensory signals from the body to the brain so that the brain can work its magic of perception and interpretation of those signals. Also in the spinal cord, we have the descending tracts, pathways, or fasciculi, which are carrying motor signals from the brain to the body. So all of those, since they are either going to the brain or coming from the brain, are going to have to pass through the medulla oblongata in order to get to the spinal cord. So if we look at a cross section, which we will in just a minute, a cross section of the medulla, well, we would see all of those pathways that we have in the spinal cord. They continue right through the medulla oblongata So we would see those. Now look at the very bottom of this picture here, and you see, well, that's the spinal cord. Recognize the gray matter, the H shape or butterfly shape area of the spinal cord, and surrounding that, those are the myelinated axons of the nerve cells out in the periphery. We call that the white matter of the spinal cord. Right there in the middle is the central canal. That is the opening right in the middle of the spinal cord, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so looking at the medulla oblongata from the front, notice that we have those two columns that are kind of shaped like baseball bats. Those are called the pyramids. Also, right at the very bottom of the pyramids, notice we have the decussation of the pyramids. What that means is that the fibers that are in the pyramids are going to cross over there. Those particular fibers that you're looking at that we call the pyramids of the medulla are the corticospinal tracts. The corticospinal tracts originate in the motor cortex. They descend by way of the internal capsule. They descend even farther by way of the cerebral peduncles. By the time we come to the medulla, there they are right out front. Those are the fibers of the corticospinal tracts. The fibers of the lateral corticospinal tract will cross at the decussation of the pyramids. The fibers of the anterior corticospinal tract do not cross at the decussation of the pyramids, but they will cross before they exit the spinal cord and go out to innervate the skeletal muscles. So these are our two primary skeletal muscle pathways. We are sending the notion to make a motion down to those muscles, and those fibers are traveling in the corticospinal tracts, which is what you see right there on the very front of the medulla oblongata. All right, notice also we have some swellings a little bit out to the side from there. Those are called the olives because they are shaped like olives. We will see the olives in a little greater detail when we take a cross section of the medulla. Now we do have the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves in the medulla. They are 9, 10, 11, and 12. So cranial nerve number 9 is glossopharyngeal. Its nucleus is located in the medulla. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve, nucleus in the medulla. Cranial nerve number 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. Its nucleus is in the medulla. It does go down to the spinal cord and then come back up again, but its nucleus is in the medulla. Also, cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve, has its nucleus also in the medulla oblongata. Now we don't see it here because we're just looking at the anterior surface of the medulla, but we will talk about an area that is deep in the brainstem called the reticular formation. It is within the reticular formation of the medulla that we have the nuclei that control our breathing. So those are called the respiratory nuclei, the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. This is where we have the impulse to breathe. They say, well, you know, I thought that I breathed consciously. Well, you don't breathe consciously if you're asleep. So how is it that you continue breathing when you're asleep? Well, the firing comes from those respiratory nuclei in the medulla, which are located in the reticular formation. Also in the reticular formation of the medulla, we have the cardiac nuclei. Well, I thought the heart beat of its own nature. Well, it does, but we can change its rate. So we change the rate and force of contraction of the heart courtesy of the cardiac nuclei, which are located in the reticular formation of the medulla. Also located in the reticular formation of the medulla, we have the vasomotor nuclei, which can change the diameter of our arteries. Well, that's how we control our blood pressure. So we have the vital forces of life housed deep inside the medulla oblongata. Now, let me go back and repeat something. Everything that we talked about passing through the spinal cord, well, it's either coming from the brain or it's going to the brain. Well, those things are all going to have to be in the medulla also. So we talked about the gracile fasciculus. We talked about the cuneate fasciculus. We talked about spinocerebellar tracts. We talked about tectospinal tracts. Well, all of those tracts or fasciculi that we had in the spinal cord, we also have in the medulla. So the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus will come together in the medulla to form a structure that we call the medial lemniscus. All right, so let's take a look at the medulla in cross section, and I should be able to point those out to you a little more clearly. Well, I tried to set you up for this as best I could. So looky here, these are the things that I was just talking about that you would be able to see if you look deep into the medulla oblongata. All right, start there at the front. Well, we had those two big baseball bats out on the front side. Those were we called the pyramids. Well, there the pyramids are in cross section. Notice what is in the pyramids. Well, those are the corticospinal tracts, the motor pathways coming from the motor cortex going to the skeletal muscles. There is the hypoglossal nerve, that's cranial nerve number 12. I told you that its nucleus was in the medulla. Look at the baby blue stuff. Well, that's the medial lemniscus. I told you that the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus will come together in the medulla and form the medial lemniscus. Those are two sensory pathways that are going to the sensory cortex, transmitting primarily sensation of touch. Now, going right up from there, notice there's that reticular formation that I mentioned to you. It's in the reticular formation of the medulla that we have the vasomotor nuclei, the cardiac nuclei, and the respiratory nuclei. Well, they are situated deep within the medulla because those are the forces of life. They are best protected sitting in a deep position like that. All right, there is the nucleus of the cuneate nucleus and the gracile nucleus. Those are the nuclei of the tracts that we call the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus. They have come together to form that medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus will arise right on through the pons, right on through the midbrain, right to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So it just continues right on up the brainstem. All right, there is the fourth ventricle. When you looked at the sheep brain, there was a space between the medulla and the cerebellum. And I think I pointed out to you, well, that is the fourth ventricle. The cerebrospinal fluid comes down from the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle and from there into the central canal of the spinal cord. There we have in a yellowish orange type color the nucleus of the vagus nerve. Well, that's cranial nerve number 10. It has its nucleus in the medulla. Shown there in green, the fibers of the tectospinal tract. I talked about the tectospinal tract in another PowerPoint. The superior colliculi, and the inferior colliculi are called the tectum or the corpora quadrigemini. They are in the visual pathway and in the auditory pathway to enable us to reflexively turn our head away from things that are coming at our face. So one is responsive to sight, the other is responsive to sound. All right, so those are the structures that can be seen in the cross section of the medulla oblongata. We don't really have anything more important than the medulla because that is where the nuclei are that keep us alive. Next slide, Clyde. In a cross section of the pons, well, let's just start at the front there. Those pinkish, brownish colored fibers that are running left and right there. What we have there, it's not very clearly shown. Some of them run east and west, like what you see there. Those are called transverse fascicles. There are others that run north and south. Those would be called the longitudinal fascicles. Both of those are right at the anterior aspect of the pons. They are the fibers of the corticospinal tracts. Remember, they become the pyramids in the medulla. They become the cerebral peduncles in the midbrain. Well, here in the pons, we call them the longitudinal and the transverse fascicles. It's labeled here as the pyramidal tract because they will become the pyramids of the medulla. Okay, shown just a little bit posterior to that, the medial lemniscus. That is the combination of the gracile and cuneate fasciculi coming up from the spinal cord, relaying sensory signals to the cerebral cortex. We then have the spinothalamic tract. I mentioned to you when we were talking about the spinal cord, we have pain pathways. The spinothalamic tract is one of our principal pain signal pathways. Well, if it's coming up from the spinal cord going to the cerebral cortex, well, then obviously it has to pass through the pons. Well, there it is. So we have the lateral spinothalamic tract, one of our pain pathways. There is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Well, we have 4 cranial nerves that have their nuclei in the pons. The first one is the trigeminal. The next one is number 6, abducens. The next one is number 7, the facial nerve. And the next one is number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. All 4 of those cranial nerves have their nuclei in the pons. The only one that is shown here is the trigeminal. Well, that's because the nuclei are at different levels. So where this cut is made, we see the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. We don't see the other 3 that have their nuclei in the pons itself. Okay, the anterior spinocerebellar tract. The pons and the cerebellum are both derivatives of the metencephalon. They develop together in the embryo. So we have a direct connection from the pons to the cerebellum. So if we have a spinocerebellar tract, then the signals are coming up the spinal cord. When they get to the pons, they make a 90-degree turn and go straight back to the cerebellum. That's why they're called the spinocerebellar tracts. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the connection between the pons and the cerebellum. There is an inferior cerebellar peduncle which connects the medulla to the cerebellum. There is a middle cerebellar peduncle which also connects both the medulla and the pons to the cerebellum. And then there is a superior cerebellar peduncle, which is what's shown here. The fibers in the superior cerebellar peduncle actually go up to the midbrain. So this is a little bit misleading to show it here with the pons. More likely you would see the middle cerebellar peduncle attaching the pons to the cerebellum. The superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. Okay, there is our fourth ventricle coming down, cerebrospinal fluid within that. Let's see, what else do we have? The reticular formation. The reticular formation extends from the medulla all the way up to the hypothalamus, and it has a host of functions. One of them is simply waking a person up. It's like an alarm clock. This is what brings a person to consciousness. People who have lesions or injuries of the reticular formation will go into a coma. So it is kind of our wake up and get with it type of impulse arising from the reticular formation. It also is greatly involved in the coordination of skeletal muscle activities so that we maintain our posture and balance, etc. Okay, then we have the tectospinal tract. I have already talked about it. So we have all of these things that have to pass through the medulla and then the pons, and then the next aspect of the brainstem is the mesencephalon, which we call the midbrain. So we'll look at that on the next slide, please. Well, don't let this picture scare you. It's a little bit busy, but I wanted to show it first because I want you to see where the midbrain is located before we take a cross-sectional look at it. Now, remember that the thalamus and the hypothalamus, those are parts of the diencephalon. We will talk about that in another PowerPoint. This PowerPoint deals with the brain stem. That would include the mesencephalon, the midbrain, the metencephalon, pons and cerebellum, and the myelencephalon, which is the medulla and the spinal cord. So see there the cerebral peduncle. Those are the fibers of the corticospinal tracts. They will go through the pons and then they will cross over in the medulla as at the decussation of the pyramids. See there the superior colliculus. That area of the midbrain is called the tectum, the roof of the midbrain. So there are two superior colliculi and there are two inferior colliculi. All taken together, they are called the corpora quadrigemini. Now, what about the cranial nerves that have their nuclei in the midbrain? Well, that would be cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, and cranial nerve number 4, trochlear. So both of those innervate the extraocular muscles to move the eyeballs. So two cranial nerves coming from the midbrain or having their nucleus in the midbrain. The corpora quadrigemini are there, the cerebral peduncles. Now, when we look at it in cross section, which is on the next slide, we'll see some of the deeper structures of the midbrain, but truthfully, the next slide is about as lousy as any slide has ever been, but I'll try to make some sense out of it anyway. Well, I probably could have found a better picture. I don't know. I went through Google Images looking for a good cross section of the midbrain, and this is the best I could come up with, and it is awful. Anyway, let me see if I can get you oriented here and point to a few things that are important. So out front, which is down at the bottom of the view here, what is called the crus cerebri. That anterior most part those are the cerebral peduncles. They're shown in white. So the crus cerebri consist of the cerebral peduncles, which are the fibers of the corticospinal tracts right there on the front of the midbrain. Then shown in black, that is the substantia nigra, which is just a funny way of saying the black stuff. It is in the substantia nigra that we have the cells which make dopamine. So this has been pointed to as the area of the brain that fails as a person develops Parkinson's disease. The cells of the substantia nigra stop producing dopamine, and consequently the person develops Parkinsonian symptoms. The third part of the crus cerebri is called the red nucleus. So those three things together constitute the crus cerebri: cerebral peduncles, substantia nigra, and the red nucleus. The red nucleus is the origin of what is called the rubrospinal tracts. There are no rubrospinal tracts in humans. I mentioned to you when we were talking about the spinal cord that the rubrospinal tracts in humans have simply blended in with the corticospinal tracts, so they are involved in the transmission of signals to the skeletal muscles. Notice there we have the spinothalamic tract. Well, those are ascending fibers transmitting signals of pain. We have the medial lemniscus, that's the combination of the gracile and cuneate fasciculi passing through the pons on its way to the cerebral cortex. So everything that was in the spinal cord has to pass through the medulla, has to pass through the pons, has to pass through the midbrain. Shown there, the cerebral aqueduct, well, that is the tube that conducts cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So it is an aqueduct, or it is a tube through which the cerebrospinal fluid flows. Surrounding the tube, notice that they have it colored gray. That is called the periaqueductal gray matter. So they did good to color it gray. Periaqueductal means it just surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. It does have some rather ill-defined functions, and I rarely remember what they are. I just know where it is, and that's all I would expect you to know. The periaqueductal gray matter is in the midbrain surrounding the cerebral aqueduct. At the roof of the midbrain is where we find the corpora quadrigemini, the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi. The nucleus of cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, also cranial nerve number 4, trochlear, is in the midbrain. The black area there, it looks like the line is pointing to the black area for oculomotor nucleus. That line should be pointing to the little blue spot for oculomotor nucleus. What is shown there in black, that is the reticular formation. Remember, the reticular formation goes all the way from the medulla to the hypothalamus, so it passes right through the midbrain also. So those are the major features of the midbrain seen in cross section. Next slide, Clyde. All right, here at the very end is a good time to kind of put them all together. And I think that this illustration does that most excellently. So looking here then, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain called the mesencephalon, as I told you. Notice there what they call the mesencephalic aqueduct. That is the cerebral aqueduct passing right through the midbrain, becoming the fourth ventricle, which becomes the central canal of the spinal cord. So that's how our cerebrospinal fluid circulates. We have the pons, we have the medulla, we have the midbrain. All three of those connect to the cerebellum. So we have incoming sensory signals coming up the spinal cord to the medulla. They will divert to the cerebellum by way of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So those are sensory signals coming up the spinal cord from the medulla to the cerebellum by way of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. From the pons, we have sensory signals coming up the spinal cord through the medulla to the pons and then diverting to the cerebellum by way of the middle cerebellar peduncle. Then we have the midbrain. I mentioned to you on the previous slide that there is a superior cerebellar peduncle. This is for signals to come from the cerebellum back to the brainstem at the level of the midbrain. So that is the superior cerebellar peduncle. So we have two inputs, the inferior peduncle and the middle peduncle, going to the cerebellum. This is sensory information about muscle movements, posture, and balance. The cerebellum is a chief controlling center for maintaining balance and posture and coordinating skeletal muscle movements. So we have to get feedback. So the feedback comes up the spinal cord to the medulla, to the pons, to the cerebellum. The cerebellum then has to relay that information to the motor cortex. Well, that's why we have the superior cerebellar peduncle, which goes from the cerebellum to the midbrain to the thalamus. From the thalamus, we have connections to the basal nuclei. Those were called the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Perhaps you recall, I pointed that out in the sheep brain. These are nuclei which coordinate our skeletal muscle contractions. Otherwise, our movements become meaningless. They have no coordination. All right, so we're talking about here the cerebellum. You remember that the cerebellum does have 4 lobes of gray matter, punctuated by the arbor vitae, which is white matter. Those are myelinated axons in the cerebellum. So there are many other things done by the cerebellum besides coordinating and organizing skeletal muscle movements. That is one of its chief functions, but the cerebellum is also involved in things like timekeeping. If a person has a cerebellar lesion, they would not be able to play the drums or play music. They are unable to keep time. Timekeeping is a cerebellar function. Also, visual tracking. Moving the eyes in response to movements of the rest of the body to be able to track things with the eyes is a cerebellar function. Also, some vocalizations are coordinated by the cerebellum. If a person has a certain cerebellar lesion, they are unable to pronounce certain words correctly. So the cerebellum has some input into our vocalizations. One other thing the cerebellum seems to be involved in is the ability to pay attention. It has been observed that people who have attention deficit disorder have abnormalities associated with their cerebellum. So in addition to being a chief coordinator of skeletal muscle movements, the cerebellum has a lot of other things that it is involved in. Even though it's a very small part of the brain, they say that 50%, half of the neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum. How cool is that?